Mark, I can remember back with DEA in the early 90s when cell phones were analog. They had just come out, and there was a device about the size of a textbook, and you could sit outside someone's house with this device and capture all the cell phones that were being used inside the house. Really didn't have the ability to track at that time. And that was when cell phones were analog. Moving forward, cell phones became digital. The tracking, there's incredible tracking technologies now for cell phones, right? That's the way law enforcement finds a lot of people. But machines cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. You need a court order to use the machine. Very expensive, very restrictive how it can be used. But guess what? What if there's a company, Mark? What if I told you there was a company out there and they bought information just from a couple apps, maybe Uber, so they have Uber Eats, DoorDash, Grubhub. What if a company bought data from just those apps so they would get a phone number? They would see where you are when you're ordering. They would see where your food is getting delivered to. And probably more importantly than any of that stuff, they would have a credit card associated with your account.
Hmm.
Now, why is that credit card important? It's a verification of identity, right?
Hmm.
If I say my name's Mark Garrett and I put in a credit card for Bill Bodner, it's not going to work. So that information, that data becomes more valuable when it's associated with a credit card because that gives credence to the fact that it's a real person, a real account. So
Hmm.
all of a sudden now I can buy for pennies information about really where someone lives. If all I have is a phone number, I can buy the data and see where they're getting food delivered to at 8 o'clock at night, where they're going to when they're picked up at the airport, and guess what? No court order required. Available for a few cents. This type of data out there available for a few cents. When you hear about that and you see all the information that and people, Mark, I really think a lot of it is people don't know that they're providing access to this information. It's become such a cloudy world of opt out, opt in. I allow, I don't allow while open. Does a human have a God-given right to their own data? I think that's a very basic question to start off with. Is data something that you have the right to and you should have the ownership to and be explicitly asked if you're okay with selling that data or giving up that data?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, this is a philosophical question. It's a legal question, personal question. Bill, you touched on some stuff there so important about DoorDash delivering to a certain address, things like that. And really, what the big picture is here that these companies, these providers are building an overall profile, building a lifestyle profile of hundreds of millions, billions of people around the world. Some of this is it's just business. It's just the attempt to market and to influence. Nothing different in that sense than it's been for thousands of years when you're trying to get someone to buy something, trying to sell something. That's not new. What's new is the reach and the intimacy that these companies have now and how intrusive all of this is. Question about do we have a right to our data? Of course, the simple answer is yes. But like you said, all these click, allow, don't allow, only when I'm using the app. Are we just getting used to it? Is it getting so prominent, so prevalent, so ubiquitous in every step, in every day of our life? Are we actually just missing out on how regular, how persistent, how much of a part of our daily life this stuff is? It's just getting to the point where we're unconscious about it now. It's like walking, we don't think about it anymore. And we don't realize that we actually are part of our own problem if we want to secure our privacy. The thing is, if you call somebody with caller ID, they automatically have your phone number. They automatically now know, okay, it's Mark Garrett calling me, unless you have a supposedly a block on your number, things like that. So in that sense, you have voluntarily now shared your data because you know that caller ID is a part of our everyday lives now. So to not only a large extent, I would say probably the majority of the time, we are our own worst enemy.
Mhm.
Now, the reality is that we are living in a world that where it's now more and more difficult to avoid these things. Even if you're being diligent about not providing extra information, ancillary information, or what might think is ancillary, but it's very personal. But even if you're working very hard, it is a very difficult process now not to share your information. The infrastructure to virtual reality is so huge now. It is almost impossible to avoid it, and we're stuck on it. The question is, in that arena, what are the things that you can do to reduce exposure and to increase your security? I'm not sure I have the answer, but that's a question we have to we have to ask because the reality is we're living in this strange, brave new world.
Yeah, and Mark, I think what I'll add to that is I think maybe we've become numb to how offensive this is. And here's what I mean by that. When on the surface, when you hear about this, right? Oh, your locational data from your cell phone is being taken. And even someone like me says, well, listen, I understand that. I'm going to use Waze. I'm going to use Google Maps. I'm going to use Apple Maps. Obviously, that app has to know where I am in order to have functionality, in order to help me go where I want to go, in order to be effective. So, in that sense, I'm thinking like, yeah, I understand why it needs that information. But that's why I encourage people to do those steps I talked about at the beginning of the show, because when you start to see things that make no sense, when you see a podcasting app tracking your location, when you see a podcasting app accessing your photos or your contacts, the question becomes why? What does that have to do with the functionality of the app? And the answer, it has nothing to do with it. What's happened is there's these tools to build apps. I don't know, there's a term for it. I think it's called an SDK, a software development kit, right? So people have made these SDKs available to app builders, and they have built in these kits the ability to track location and track some of these other things. So when an app developer takes this SDK and puts together an app, that app all of a sudden has become an intelligence collector for that library of information, so to speak. And sometimes the app builder may not even know that this information is being queried in there. Let's also talk about the scope of this. Right now, let me see that the number of companies, I thought it was staggering. There's 6 companies out there that claim to have data from more than 1 billion phone devices. 6 companies, each of whom says we have data from over 1 billion devices. In essence, this is almost everyone, right? If you're using any kind of apps on your phone, almost everyone is tracked. The New York Times did a story, and it was a number of years ago. I think it was back in 2019, about a data set of 50 billion pings. Now, what a ping is, it's just like a one data point, one locational data point called a ping. That probably comes from back in the early days of radar, when radar would send a sound off something and it would ping back. They were able to track individual users from location to location and see how long they stayed at each location over a period of several months from 2016 and 2017. This didn't require a court order, Mark.
Mhm.
All it required was a checkbook. They just bought some data and they sat down and put it together. The scope of data brokering right now, well, I talked about the 6 companies, but there's really over 50 companies that are in this space that are viable, big data brokers that either create, buy, sell, analyze, repackage. And I would say it's not always above board. And I think sometimes people would be shocked if they heard what was being done with this data. For example, one company collected data from a Muslim prayer app and sold it to a company that contracted for the military.
Hmm.
Another sold it to federal agencies for use in immigration enforcement. And another example that was given was someone who bought data for phones tracking around a Tesla plant. And by doing this was tracking the amount of overtime people worked. That's how granular it was. They could
Yeah.
see when people showed up for work. They knew what the standard shift was. They knew if people were working doubles, that the demand was high, production was going up, and they were using that hedge funds basically, or maybe not hedge funds, but investment companies to gauge where demand was for the product, how much they should invest, if they should invest. So this is data that's really available everywhere now. And Mark, how about this one? This is one that really troubles me. And I guarantee this is happening right now. Locational data of phones at military bases, right?
Right.
You think this is not packaged up and exploited by the Chinese
Yeah.
or by the Russians? Through locational data, they know every phone that's in use on a particular military base. When all of a sudden, Mark, all those phones leave that base and now they appear in Germany, what do they know? They
They know
know
about
that
movements. They know
they
about
know about
strategies.
movement, whatever capabilities that base has, whether it's a mechanized division, whatever it is, they now know where it is deployed. And
Yep.
hey, a lot of times I get it. People say, no, there's rules, but they're not supposed to bring phones on.
Really.
Come on. Yeah.
Yeah.
So don't think that this isn't being used right now by foreign governments to exploit our capabilities, the movements of our military, and everything else.